Hello, and welcome to another Gwentcity video. Today, we're at the science lab of Gwentcity, and with us is Professor and Jiu-Jitsu martial artist, Went to Town. Went to Town, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Manti. We are really getting creative with these introductions, man.
Yeah, I know. But, I have to give you credit where credit is due. So, what's cooking in the lab? Can you give us an explanation of this deck?
Yes, this deck is just a hybrid monster deck, we would say. It's kind of like an tempo deck, but it's also a control deck when it needs to be. Basically, it is characterized for playing very aggressive on round one, pulling out all of your monsters from your deck, and then when you secure round one victory, or you really exhausted the cards on your opponent's hand, you play like a controlling play style, but also capitalizing on your strengths, like slapping weathers for big power swings and all that stuff. It's a really solid deck and really recommended for everyone that wants to get MMR and rank up really easily. So this is just the deck.
From what rank can I play this deck? Because you know that the meta has different layers, and sometimes a specific deck won't work from the bottom. So, can I play this deck from the very bottom?
Well, I would assure you this deck is a power horse. It is really hard to counter, even though it seems like weather would be pretty easy to counter, right? Just first light. It's not that easy to counter at all. And if you play correctly, I think you can play this deck from rank 1 to rank 15 to top 1 if you want, and if you are skilled enough.
Now, talking about that, let's talk percentages. What's the percentage of winning in this deck so far?
Well, with this deck, I have a win percentage of about 60%, maybe a little bit more. Uh, yeah, because we were just testing a lot of iterations at first, and the win rate wasn't really going that well. But after a while, it really took off. Uh, I think this deck is pretty solid against the meta, and it has a good deal of good matchups. So pretty much you're never gonna be really disadvantaged against anything.
Oh, okay. Now, the other thing is that we have a lot of free to play warriors, and they would like to know how expensive is this deck?
Well, this deck is not really that expensive. Of course, it has 4 gold cards and 6 silvers as every other deck, so it's gonna be some really costly cards in there, like the 2 legendaries we see, Avalak and Caretaker. But regardless, I would say that only 2 legendary cards to craft and about 7 epics or 8 is not that big of a deal. Most players would be able to craft this deck after a while of saving or grinding. So it is not a hard deck to craft compared to the level of power it has.
Okay. So, could you tell us what's the downside to this deck?
Well, of course, this deck kind of suffers from lack of removal from big minions and also from weather immune units, right? Weather immune units, of course, ignore your main form of removal, which is the weather, or at least your main form of weakening the units of your opponent, so that you don't have to remove every single one of them. So that would be a counter, but as we will see later on the gameplay, it is sometimes really easy to manage and sometimes hard to manage, but still doable. So with this deck, you're never really hopeless, and you're not gonna have a lot of troubles winning against anything as long as you play it smart.
Okay. What's the upside to this deck?
Well, this deck has an insane tempo in round one. Is This deck is able to put around 40 power in 3 plays in round one, plus things around 6 or 7 cards out of this deck. Exactly 7, actually. 7 cards out of this deck in round one, only 3 plays and 3 cards used. This is pretty much always gonna set your opponent behind and give you an advantage that you can carry over to the other rounds and win the game easily a lot of the time.
That's pretty good. Now, let me tell you something, dude. I'm a complete noob. I'm a complete scrub at this, alright? So, let me ask you, what's the level of difficulty to play this deck?
Well, this deck is pretty easy to play. as long as you get the hang of it. When you get the hang of it, it's really easy to play. It's a little bit mechanic too, so when you start getting used to the mechanics on how to mulligan and how to put your monsters in the correct order, and also knowing how to evaluate the point difference between your opponent and when it's right to pass, when it's right to keep playing, and also use your monster passive to your maximum ability, you will find that this deck is actually pretty easy to play. You will find no problem, I think.
Let's get to the core of this, because actually before we start the play, the mulligan is the really important part. How would you mulligan on this deck?
Okay, so you have 3 or 4 key components on your hand when you're playing this deck. First, there is the Wild Hunt Riders on the middle row. So we have the Wild Hunt Riders. You want to have one of them. We have the Foglets. We want to have none of them. The Crones, and you want to have one of them. So this is pretty straightforward. But now you need to look at the weathers. That is the fourth part, right? So you want most likely 2 weathers, but the first priority is getting the minions right. When the minions are right, you can try to get the weathers, and you need to have 2 weathers, at least 1 fog to get the foglets, so don't run one. So that's the most important part. Now, to play this deck to a maximum extent, you need to comprehend the rule of blacklisting in this game. So whenever you discard a card on your mulligan or kick a card from your hand on the mulligan, that card cannot be drawn again. So it is really important to know the correct ordering in which you need to kick the cards so that you don't get, so that you get the best odds of getting a correct hand. So, for example, let me put an example here, really quick. Imagine you have 1 foglet in hand and 2 Wild Hunt Riders and 1 Crone. So the Crones are correct already. You need to throw the foglet and the Wild Hunt Rider. In this situation, it is correct to throw first the 1 copy of foglet, because there's already 2 copies of foglet in your deck. So if you throw the Wild Hunt Rider, you won't draw the Wild Hunt Rider back, the other Wild Hunt Rider that is in your deck. But you have possibilities to draw 2 of the foglets in your deck. So in that situation, it is better to kick the foglet because you only have the chances of drawing that 1 bad Wild Hunt Rider. So in that situation, you throw first the foglet, then you throw the Wild Hunt Rider, and if you draw a Crone, you throw the Crone. And then, of course, you will have some cards that are going to be very useful in some matchups. For example, the Thunder could be used in some matchups really effectively, and you want to keep that. In other matchups, you don't want to keep the Thunder, for example. I mean, the most important part are the minions, but then there's a little bit of minutia that you don't have to take care of it right now.
This deck was built by all the guys at Gwentcity, and special thanks to Tragic Star. Thank you guys for sharing this deck. Let's take this deck to the ladder.
Let's go.